This interview is an excerpt from one I did with Kingsmill Bond of Ember Energy. He and several of his colleagues, Dan Walter and Sam Butler-Sloss, have written a couple of really interesting papers in the last few months. So the Long March of Electrification came out in July, and the Electrification Imperative came out in June. And the argument here is that electrification, the triumph of electricity, the International Energy Agency says that the age of oil is over, the age of electricity is beginning. But the point that Kingsmill makes is that, in fact, electricity has been around for 150 years. And what we're seeing now is really the long run consequences of continuous development in the technology, both on the supply side, how you make electricity, and on the demand side, how you turn it into work, how you use it. And so this particular clip deals with 6 moments in that long march. And I wanted to give you kind of a little overview because 20 minutes of Kingsmill talking, you might not understand. It might not be easy to link together those 6 moments, so here they are. First one, rapid entry, 1910s. Lighting motors replace gas, candles, and steam once costs hit parity, and efficiency slashes total energy needed for the same services. So it becomes more competitive. Fast followers, that's number 2. And as costs fall, adoption spreads beyond the early rich country leaders. So you have the innovators, the early adopters, the language we use here at Energy Media. And then once the technology is established there, then other countries very quickly fall in line. There are the fast followers. 3, power and growth, 1950s and 1960s. Global electricity use grows 6% a year, outpaces oil and gas, in fact. And a lot of that is made possible by new services, new technologies for demand use, air conditioning, refrigeration, appliances, all things that we take for granted came into common use in the 50s and 60s. Number 4, oil shocks of the 1970s. I remember these, 1973, 1979. Per capita fossil fuel use stalls and electricity per capita keeps on climbing. Number 5, taking the lead, and this is in 2007. Electricity becomes number 1 in useful energy, and Kingsmill will explain the different types of energy and what he means by useful energy. Number 6, stalling fossil demand, which started in 2014 with industry, and then buildings were 2018, and transport, which is basically, transportation sector, cars and trucks and what have you, is peaking this year. So those are the 6 moments. And this is a fascinating conversation. I have other excerpts from the interview that I'll be posting this week, and I hope you enjoy it.
I think, as you say, we're trying to reframe the debate a little bit because people are not thinking in the wider systemic context of the growth of electricity. As you say, for over a century, we've had continuous or almost continuous growth of electricity. And of course, it starts tiny and all kinds of problems. It doesn't work and it burns buildings down. And the gas industry is constantly fighting against the growth of electricity in the lighting industry. And we just looked at 6 different moments in the growth of electricity over the last 120 years and made, I think, the key overall point that this is a technology which finds its way into one sector after the next, almost inexorably. And we shouldn't worry excessively about some of the difficulties being faced at the cutting edge for the deployment of electricity. We need to recognize the wider picture that it's continued to grow for a very long time and it will continue to do so.
Yeah, I think that there's a point to be made here about how electricity has almost been on its own S-curve over the last 125 years. And we're starting to see another phase of that where it's past the inflection point and now it's the cheapest energy, the most efficient source of energy of all of them. And that means that inevitably it will march up the exponential curve until it takes 80, 90, 95% of the market share.
Yeah, look, I think again, if you look at the early history of electricity, electricity first of all moved into the lighting industry after 1880, and um, the, it took a while to get a proper foothold. But of course, as soon as it did, then it very quickly, we're talking now around 1900, as soon as it did, it took about 20 years to move from 5% market share to about 80% market share as soon as people figured out how to do it. And you saw a very similar story when electricity moved into the fixed power market, which basically means machines. Machines used to be powered by steam. And then as soon as people worked out how to enable those machines to be powered by electricity, it takes about 20 years to go to dominance. And the exciting point, I think, for us now is that we've just figured out how to get electricity into the transport market, which is in technical terms basically mobile power as opposed to fixed power. And therefore we should also expect a kind of 20-year turnaround. 20 years time, someone look back and say it's completely obvious. We know how this movie worked. We figured out the solution and then we deployed it at enormous speed and scale. And it then wiped out what of course we shouldn't forget is the largest piece of final energy demand and by far the largest piece of oil demand.
Well, let's go through the quickly go through the six moments in the march to electricity's victory. So the first one is rapid entry into 19 around the 1910s. So
Yep.
lighting motors, it displaced gas, candle, steam. Once costs hit parity,
Mhm.
greater efficiency. The next one is fast followers in 1930. Maybe you could address that a little bit. What do you mean by fast followers?
So one of the things that was very notable about the rise of electricity, and again, this is not totally obvious, and you see this in many other technology shifts, the internet being another good example, is that you get leading countries, and then you get the majority which comes after them, and you get some laggard countries. And um, so what happened was that your leading countries like Germany and the United States deployed electricity quite quickly, and then actually the UK was quite slow to do it. And then you had fast followers like Japan, and then you had other countries such as China or India, which were quite a lot slower. But the point certainly is that your your other countries followed the leaders, and I think we need to recognise in the global debate on the future of energy that, and sorry, in electrification, for example, of the transport sector, and you've got a leading country now is China, and other countries are following China, and we should worry less about the fact that people are not um, moving quite as fast to China and think much more about what's happening with the leaders. So yeah, that's what happened last time round as we deployed electricity into the fixed machinery sector. You have leaders and laggard, a very clean structure. And there's no point thinking about the laggard countries because they're not the future.
Yeah, that's a very good point, is that China is leading. I think everybody's agreed on that point. Uh, but it's also true that, especially since the Americans started putting up tariffs and last year did it on their electric vehicles from China, China has really made a strong pivot into the global south. And those are now becoming the fast followers. And here in the West, Europe accepted, but certainly in North America, Canada and the US, are very much we're becoming laggards.
So I think again, we didn't talk about so much in this particular piece, but we have looked at this in some detail, is that you're seeing exactly this deflection. So as the US market has been closed to Chinese electrotech technologies, so they're flooding into the global south. Global south just became the largest market now for the sale of Chinese solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles and batteries. Um, they're now pouring to the global south. And you're seeing some incredible leapfrogs where countries like, for example, Nepal, relatively small countries, but they're going from nothing to 90% share of imports of cars being electric in the space of 2 or 3 years. And or the famous example of Pakistan, where you see this surge, the doubling of the size of the Pakistan electricity system as a result of the pouring in of Chinese solar. Now that story's happening again in Africa, where Africa is also moving up the S curve. And we can try and close off certain pieces of the system, but it's just like water. These cheap technologies, they find a way, and they're finding a way now into the global south.
The third moment that you talk about is the powering growth in the 1950s and 1960s. Global electricity use grew by 6% a year. And part of that was driven by new services, air conditioning, refrigeration, appliances. And we kind of see that again, don't we?
Yeah, I think again, this is why it is really well, first of all, it's important for governments to step up to the plate and put into place conditions where these technologies can grow. But it is also quite normal for new technologies and services to grow on the back of the superior functionality that is unleashed by electricity. So this is also slightly one of my pet peeves is that we consistently try and look at the world 20 or 30 years from now as if it's going to be the same as today, but with a few more people living it. That's not how, the historical record, of course, has worked out. So you need to think about how new technologies unleash new opportunities. So, for example, the cognification of the electrification of cognition, otherwise known as AI, it is unleashing lots of new industries, and we're basically replacing physically doing stuff that with doing it with electronics, and that again is actually going to reduce the total amount of energy that is required, even though people are focusing on the energy required for the AI.
The fourth moment here is amid the oil shocks of the 1970s, where uh, the fossil fuel use, and there we're talking coal, oil, and gas, it kind of stalls, but electricity per capita kept climbing.
So this again, I think, we did not expect to see this when we were playing around with the data that after the oil shocks in the 70s, you actually get a stagnation of fossil fuel demand per capita at a global level. All the growth since then has just been as a result of there being more people in the world. Um, and the only piece of the system which on a per capita basis has continued to grow has been electricity. Um, and again, it's to do with the fact that it's got superior functionality, and we'll come on to what's quite special about electricity right now. But even all the way back to 40, 50 years ago, all the growth's been coming on a per capita basis from electricity. I don't think that's widely appreciated.
Is it the case, Kingsmill, that up until then, I mean, there were some new services in the 50s, talked about those, air conditioning and so on. But after that, there aren't a lot of new services that are being added by electricity. It's that electricity is growing, uh, geographically, if you will. Have I got that right?
Well, I think it's both actually. I mean, I don't think we looked at this in particular detail for me to be able to comment intelligently on it. But look, it's both in terms of geographic expansion. It's also new services. It's also greater consumption of existing services. There was air conditioning, more air conditioning, there are a small number of dishwashers, a greater number of dishwashers. But yeah, I think again the key point to me is that if you're looking at a vector of growth, it's really has all been coming from electricity for a very long period, and therefore it's quite reasonable for us to expect this to continue. Again, we'll come on in a second to what happens if you continue if you extrapolate this kind of 3% growth for another 20, 30 years, because of course once you get to where we are now, 22% of the system, and you keep on going at 3% growth, particularly when the total growth is slowing for a variety of reasons, you actually get quite a radical shift in the significance of what's happening. That's why we're starting to talk about electricity 2.0.
Now, the fifth moment occurs in 2007 when electricity becomes the number one in useful energy. And I don't think we talked enough about useful energy. Maybe you could explain that concept.
Sure. So, without raising your geek rating, as it were, too high, there are three types of energy. There's primary, final, and useful. And in English, useful is what you and I use. It's the name suggests. Like we flick on the light comes on. That's great. That's useful energy. Um, and one of the strange things about the energy system is that we have, or the companies who produce the energy have tended to dominate the debate. It's all about tons of oil and or barrels of oil and tons of coal. Um, so when you and one of the problems with looking at this from a production basis, again, this is fairly well known. You have something called the primary energy fallacy. You also have a final energy fallacy, which again in English means that two-thirds of your energy basically is wasted in the fossil fuel system between between extracting it from the ground and turning it into something that useful that you and I can use to drive the car or flick the lights on. And so what we did is we took IEA and IASA data and we figured out the size of useful energy supply. And again, a little bit to my surprise, useful energy, electricity is already providing 1/3 of useful energy, which is more than we're getting from oil today. And the reason I mention this is because the fossil fuel folks love to say, oh, electricity is only 22% of final energy demand. It's really quite small, and 80% is fossil fuels. We are much bigger. But actually, when you look at useful and then you disaggregate, of course, coal, oil, and gas, you find that electricity is already the biggest piece of the system at a useful energy level, and it has been since 2007. I mean, so once more, we should not underestimate the power and significance of what's happening inside the electricity sector.
Now, the last one is stalling fossil demand, which from 2014 on. And it seems to me that what's happened in the last 11 years is that a lot of technologies on the electric side that held a great deal of promise and were beginning to gain ground rapidly became more economic, became competitive, past their inflection point around 2020. And now we are on the exponential part of the curve, but we're only 5 years into it. There's a lot more growth to come. And I remember something that you told me probably about 2 years ago during an interview. You said these technologies will first of all take the growth. And
Yeah.
then once they've got 100% of the growth, then they'll start eating into existing demand. And that seems to be just about where we are now.
Yeah. So again, when we make this statement, you have to recognize this primary, final, and useful. We're looking at the final piece of the puzzle. That is to say, the energy which you can count most easily, which is going into final energy demand. And the IEA has got very good statistics on that. In fact, the World Energy Balance just came out a couple of weeks ago, looking in detail at this. And when you again disaggregate that, you see that final energy demand for the industrial sector peaks around 2014. We're going to be bouncing around on a plateau ever since then. Very largely driven, I should say, by the electrification of light industry in China. So don't forget, it's people often talk about heavy industry, how hard it is to decarbonize, but there's a huge amount of light industry with energy heat demands of lower than 200 degrees centigrade, which you can electrify quite quickly. And the Chinese have been doing it. China's the workshop of the world. And so you're seeing this peaking of fossil fuel demand inside the industrial sector. In the housing sector, in the building sector, I should say, again, actually, it's a slightly different story. Basically, you've got very little heat demand growth going on because you've got peak population already in the global north, and there's therefore very little population growth, and again, your electrification going on in there. So again, peak fossil fuel demand from our calculations 2018 in the buildings sector, and then finally, of course, you get the transportation sector, where you have actually the most vulnerable piece because it's so incredibly inefficient, where electrification is coming in at speed.
Well, let's talk about transportation and electrification. You say that it's nearing its peak by the mid 2020s. We're here already. Are we seeing peak oil demand, I guess, for transportation already? I mean, the IEA came out a few months ago and said that they were moving peak oil demand at the global level from 2030 to 2029. But certainly, it looks like China's already peaked. So, what's your take on that?
So again, what's going on? And again, the IEA would, if you look at the IEA statistics, it's quite interesting. You actually get a peak in oil demand outside Chinese petchem in 2018. All the growth since then has come well, almost all the growth has come from petchem, Chinese petchem specifically. And then there's some biofuel demand growth that's gone on. But actually, in terms of like classic oil demand, we've had no growth since 2018. So that's one angle. And again, the reason why it's not particularly difficult is because you've had this very rapid electrification of the Chinese transport sector, and therefore all of the growth that was meant to come through, we're now getting about 1 million barrels of oil a day incremental production in oil demand as a result of electrification of the transport sector. What I think is most interesting about transport is that it is, as I say, the soft underbelly of the fossil fuel system. It's almost all oil. It's much more expensive than any alternative and very heavily taxed. It's the most heavily imported and the most expensive piece of the system, up to 5% of GDP in many countries, for example. And now, for the first time, we've got a proper alternative in electricity. So it when I look at the data back to the to when electricity came into the gas lighting business, it's quite hard, but it still only took 20 years. This time round, you could easily imagine oil being pushed out of transport, certainly in China and right across Asia, incredibly quickly.